the whole thing. We'll just have to read out any chat as we discuss things. That should have triggered recording. Yeah, you should have all just received a little notification that said,
yeah, I heard that.
Okay, thank you. Great. Last but not least, thumbs up from Kyle. Awesome. If everyone could please put your name, your state, and the agency, employer, or group that you represent in the chat starting now so that people can see it and understand the audience. That would be great. Keep it brief. And I'm going to ignore the chat momentarily as that rolls in while I get started with the presentation. And I'm just going to do my best to close up some windows. Russ, you are off mute. Can you mute yourself just to remove background noise, please? Thank you. All right. So in my capacity as the Forest Health Program Director for the Nature Conservancy, like I said, I work a lot on firewood because firewood is one of the most important domestic pathways for the movement of invasive forest pests and pathogens that affect North American trees. And the importance of managing the firewood pathway is understood and shared by all. The mechanisms by which we manage the firewood pathway are not often as well agreed upon nor executed. So one of the things that we're going to be talking about in this webinar are the different approaches, the different priorities, and the sort of differences in what happens next when you look at firewood from the perspective of the US states. And I'm going to do my best to focus also on emerald ash borer specifically throughout this presentation. But we're going to cover firewood as a concept and emerald ash borer as a case study in terms of the sort of approach. And I'm going to reopen chat. Like I said, please jump in either verbally or via chat if you have questions. Okay, so before we begin, because some of this vocabulary is a little esoteric, if you're not super familiar with the topic, I'm going to start off with vocab. So quarantine, as used in common forest pest contexts, come in two basic types, and this is a really important concept. There's external or exterior quarantines, which protect things from entering a protected area. Prevent things from entering a protected area, or internal or interior quarantines, which prevent things that we don't want to move from departing an infested area. Now on this map, what you can see is the spotted lanternfly fairly recent distribution map, which incorporates a bunch of squiggly red lines. Those are internal quarantines. Those are areas that those particular states, so for instance, Pennsylvania, state of, have said we do not want potentially infested items to depart from the red bounded zone into the rest of the state of Pennsylvania or frankly, anywhere else. There are also external quarantines on spotted lanternfly that are held by states. California holds one, other states hold other ones. But those are not represented on the map by the internal state quarantine areas. So there's two different types. Regulated item, for anybody who's not super familiar with this terminology, is just something that cannot cross a quarantine border boundary. In this context, there is a legal definition. It cannot cross the boundaries without appropriate treatment or inspection or certification. Now, in the course of this presentation, I'm going to talk about firewood extensively as a regulated item, but for many, many pests, and in fact, I would say all pests, firewood is not the only regulated item. So firewood is one, but for instance, when we're talking about, let's just go with spotted lanternfly, any sort of external structure or personal item could be one, such as a portable doghouse could be a regulated item if you were moving to a new home. For some pests, any sort of outside item that's in contact with the soil, such as an outdoor houseplant, would apply as a regulated item. But we're not going to talk about doghouses and houseplants today. We're going to talk about firewood. New terminology to learn. The Lymantria dispar, which was formerly referred to by a common name gypsy moth, has been officially renamed as of a couple weeks ago. Its new name is spongy moth. This is going to be an adjustment for everybody. I'm going to do my best to say spongy moth consistently, but I have been saying the term gypsy moth for almost my entire life. So if I make a mistake and say gypsy moth in any kind of professional context, I'm sure you all understand. I will do my best to stick to spongy moth throughout the course of the presentation. And I hope everyone else can figure out how they're going to do their best to do the same. So emerald ash borer was regulated domestically as a federally quarantined pest for about 22 years. And as part of that domestic federal quarantine, the movement of firewood was restricted. Now, in this case, that included at the time, both domestic and international quarantines, as well as the authority afforded by those to run heat treatment programs to allow for the movement of regulated items like firewood. So these were sometimes informally called firewood certification programs. Now you can see in the upper right-hand map, that's the 2012 map, the bluish boundary bounding a bunch of red dots is the firewood quarantine that was in place at that time domestically. Switch to below, this is the 2020 map, I believe. I'm sorry, the text is tiny, I can't even read it. You can see those red dots, which represent individual fines in a one per county, are much more widespread. The infestation is much larger, and that quarantine has been lifted. So there is no blue line bounding those dots. So that is an example of approximately 10 years of difference in approach. So without the federal domestic quarantine in place for emerald ash borer, that puts the onus on states, tribes, and various landowning entities, just like Joey was asking at the beginning verbally, in case anybody joined after he mentioned it, about the Department of Interior and National Park and Monument units, to actually make their own decisions to decide to either impose or change or decline to impose or change regulations that pertain to the movement of firewood. Now, the movement of firewood allows for the movement of multiple pests. So it allows for the reproduction of things like emerald ash borer in new areas, and thereby allowing for the spread of things like emerald ash borer to new areas. This is particularly important to the Western United States because if your state does not have an external quarantine on emerald ash borer specifically, it is theoretically possible that the commercial movement of firewood could legally bring in emerald ash borer contaminated firewood at this time. Before the domestic quarantine was removed, that was not the case. It would have been illegal. Now, without state, tribe, or park, or whoever based regulations, it would be legal to do so. So this also impacts firewood producers and distributors because the legal framework for the certification of firework changed very dramatically in the formally regulated areas. So if you imagine back a couple slides, that blue boundary, that also enabled the legal conditions to create certified heat treated firewood through federal authority. So certified heat treated firewood can't be certified without an agency or entity that's authorized to do so. If you don't have some sort of a legal capability through an agency like a federal or state agency or any kind of other entity, depending on the specifics, then certified heat treated firewood is just firewood that got heated up for a while. It's not actually certified, and it's not a legally qualified product in terms of creating exemptions from quarantines. So that's one of the direct effects of the release of the federal quarantine, but one of the secondary impacts of deregulation of emerald ash borer is that it sort of started a conversation in other spaces. So some of those other spaces that now have had more conversations include what sort of is and sort of isn't just a coincidence of timing. There's a lot of state by state decisions in the Eastern United States to deregulate thousand cankers disease also occurring because of just I would say almost a modernization of the understanding of that pest. It was fairly new to science when it first was discovered throughout the largely Eastern states, United States, to be a forest pest. The research environment around it has changed, and so some of the regulations are changing. It also, the deregulation of emerald ash borer also created a lot of discussion by some folks that were impacted by this change in legal status on the certification of firewood. So interesting discussions on third-party certification. And then also a lot of folks have been looking towards the spongy moth federal regulation to offer that framework that allows for the legal certification of firewood. So in order to better get a grip on the complexity of the situation, my coworker and I, Laurel Downs, some of you have emailed extensively with Laurel, thank you for that, have been spending the last 4 months building this Firewood Comparison Report. So it compares the state and territorial firewood relevant regulations, certifications, and outreach statuses across the United States in a highly standardized way, and also in a way that is very visual. So instead of pouring through pages and pages and pages of data, we got a lot of maps, basically. Let me just make sure my chat doesn't have any important questions for me. Looks good. Anybody who has a question, please talk to me on chat. Okay, so when you think about the regulations that apply to firewood, you can kind of wrangle them into a couple different broad categories in order to better understand them. Now, I've already talked about how there's interior and exterior, or internal and external quarantines, but there's also spatially drawn ones. So if you think about like geopolitical boundaries, like around a state, that's a spatially drawn regulation. Then there's a distance from origin regulation. These are rare because they are perceived as more difficult to sort of explain to the public, but they do exist. And that's like, you can't move firewood legally more than 50 miles is an example of that. And then there's pest-driven regulations. Now, a lot of you are familiar with emerald ash borer-based state quarantines. You may hold one in your state. That would be a pest-driven regulation that is both spatially drawn and driven by the presence, absence, or concern about a pest. So you got a lot of variation in the different types of regulations that directly pertain to firewood, even though none of these actually are a literal firewood regulation necessarily. So when you look at all these different types of firewood relevant statewide external rules and regulations, you can create this crazy map, which Russ Bullock has termed the periodic table of firewood, I believe. And it is meant to provide a quick visual on the variation of firewood relevant regulations. Now, you will note pretty quickly that if you divided the country on the, what is that, the 100th meridian, is that right? All of the brick colored states with the most extensive all out-of-state firewood regulations are east of it. And all of you guys, the western states, are west of it. Now, you do have 2 states that have a regulation that we would define as a some out-of-state firewood, which is Oregon and Utah, but the majority of states in the western states do not have anything but a pest-based regulation or no regulation at all. 2 states are taking action right now to change that condition. Nevada and Hawaii are currently proposing or preparing or otherwise getting ready to implement a change in regulation that will bring them to an all out-of-state firewood quarantine. So you can see there's tremendous regional variation here. There are quite a few states that have no external rule or regulation pertaining to firewood. That is a somewhat random assortment, I would say, personally. Not entirely random, of course. And Russ is joking that the transitional metals on the periodic table are states like Nevada and Hawaii, absolutely. But it's interesting to note that, for instance, Florida has an all out-of-state firewood quarantine, and actually it has one of the oldest all out-of-state firewood quarantines in the United States, but Georgia has nothing. So obviously, necessarily being a southeastern United States state does not tell you what to do. There's variation. There are also pest-driven regulations that are driven by concerns that are pests that are not federally regulated, which is an important element because emerald ash borer is no longer domestically federally regulated. Mountain pine beetle drives the Minnesota exterior quarantine on pine product from the western states. Rapid ohia death, which is a fungus that kills the native ohia tree on the Hawaiian Islands. There is an inter-island quarantine to limit the movement of that pest so they can better cope with it. The spotted lanternfly does not have a domestic federal quarantine. There's various state regulations. There's lots of concern. There's lots of programs addressing spotted lanternfly, but there is not an overarching federal domestic quarantine on that pest.
I'll just add, just to interrupt, sorry, this is Kyle from California, that in the case of the spotted lanternfly, here's an example of one, at least for us, where the compliance with the quarantine really wouldn't protect you from these other forest pests unless you happen to, find them during inspection, because to comply, you just have to do an inspection and determine that it's free from spotted lanternfly life stages, right? So there may be other standard things that we do at our border stations. I know there are, but In this case, the quarantine, it's against, firewood from these infested areas for SLF, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's protecting you against the other forest pests.
No, not at all. I think that's a really good point, Kyle, that each one of these things represents a unique set of risks. And for the hitchhiker pests, for spotted lanternfly and for spongy moth, that's a particularly complicated situation. Like you said, you have to inspect goods to see if those egg masses are adhering to the goods. And goods is a ridiculous statement. It's basically anything outside. So a vehicle could even be problematic, because if you parked it near a what is the name of that tree? I'm blanking. Tree of Heaven. If you parked it near a tree of heaven during the breeding season for this pest, it could easily end up with egg cases on it. Okay, so great point. Thank you, Kyle. So laurel wilt, which is an invasive pest fungal complex currently found in the southeastern and south central eastern, it's moving north, part of the United States, is a particularly difficult pest to manage, and there are no regulations on it. Likewise, in the southwestern south section of California, there are multiple species of invasive shot hole borers that, to the best of my knowledge, do not currently have any regulations that regulate the movement of materials that are legal regulations pertaining to those pests, firewood or not. So you've got this tremendous variation in approach that is important to understand. In order to better understand the environment of state-based non-external quarantines, so things that are not just the outside barrier of the state, we went through in the report and quantified every single one of the different types of non-external quarantines. So we looked at states with state-based restrictions on intrastate firewood movement. Like I said, these are rare. So there's one legal regulation held by New York, and there's two relevant other states. Illinois has a proposed proposed distance-based restriction, and Maine has a proof of Maine source restriction that's pretty similar. And so those are three states basically that try to limit the movement of firewood through that mechanism. Then there's 9 different states that have a state lands or parks specific restriction or regulation on the movement of firewood. And then one that allows state parks to put in place legal frameworks if they so choose. So it's an opt-in system. So that makes for 10 that have some kind of state lands system. And then there's 22 states that have a pest-specific state-held quarantine. Many of the states that you all represent have one of these. So you are one of those 22 states, almost entirely, across the different attendees in this presentation. And so the movement of firewood within your state may be regulated. So again, we're going to use the spotted lanternfly because it's a really great case study for how things work. Just because you have spotted lanternfly doesn't mean you necessarily regulate it. So for instance, at the time of this map making, to the best of the abilities of New York State, they do not believe that Ohio has any internal state quarantine surrounding those 2 counties that have known spotted lanternfly infestations. So they have spotted lanternfly, but they have not opted to make any restrictions on intrastate movement of materials, which would include the regulated item of firewood. In contrast, it looks to me like Virginia, unless I'm reading the map wrong, has a 3-county area that is quarantined, but then multiple other counties that are not. So it's a complicated system that is regulating some, but not all, movement of firewood in this area for that pest. Then you add states that are either fully or partially under a federal quarantine. So I'll go through the alphabet soup here in case anybody doesn't know all of these abbreviations, which is utterly understandable. Asian longhorn beetle has 4 different states with partial federal quarantine that pertains to firewood. Imported fire ant has 14 states that have regulations on the movement of soil or items that are in direct contact with soil. It is very common to store piles of firewood directly on contact with naked soil. So that could pertain to the movement of firewood. Puerto Rico is also included in that group. Spongy moth is covered in 20 different states. That is either full or partial, depending on the geography of your spongy moth infestation for your state. Sudden oak death is in 2 states, Oregon and California. Great giant African snail Florida has a success story. They recently declared the eradication of giant African snail. However, giant African snail is still present on multiple islands in Hawaii and 3 territories. So that's 1 state, not Florida, just Hawaii and 3 territories. And then some states have absolutely no interior firewood regulation that applies to the best of our abilities, nor a pest-based quarantine. That's 12 different states and territories that are covered in that. So for instance, oh, we got a comment. Let me take a quick look before I launch into my talk about sudden oak death. Based on Pennsylvania spotted lanternfly quarantine, Kyle, Becky, I'm not sure how to say your name, sorry Kyle, suspect that most and all internal spotted lanternfly quarantines use an inspection to comply, which might not protect against non-spotted lanternfly forest pests because that's based on the presence of spotted lanternfly egg masses. It's a really good point. So an inspection-based quarantine for spotted lanternfly would not protect against the movement of emerald ash borer infested firewood because you would inspect the ash firewood and find it to be not containing spotted lanternfly egg masses. It's a really, really good point, Kyle, that pest-specific quarantines are, as they sound, specific to the pests. And so a pest-specific quarantine for something like spongy moth, spotted lanternfly may not have protective qualities for other people for things like emerald ash borer. Okay. Sudden oak death is present in many counties in the western northern sector of California, as well as I believe just 1 county in Oregon. Yes, Curry County. Firewood is technically on the regulation here, even though that is an interesting scientific question, but we're not going to get into that. Firewood is on the regulation and you cannot move firewood that is potentially infested from these counties into other parts of California or Oregon. Likewise, if we all take a quick look at the map for imported fire ant, also called red imported fire ant, you can see that while California and New Mexico have very discrete zones of infestation, single counties, and even I think single regions within those counties, of course, most of the Western states do not have imported fire ant, and boy howdy, do you not want imported fire ants. So you would want to prevent the movement of direct contact firewood stored on the dirt from any of these regulated areas into your state. And technically speaking, that would be illegal, but it is best to look at this from the comprehensive approach and see whether or not both the receiving state and the exporting state for materials should have regulations on the books. So when we talk about regulations on the books, sometimes it gets a little overlooked that the emerald ash borer federal deregulation also resulted in this big change in the ability to legally heat treat and certify firewood. So as part of our report, we made sure to cover this in extensive research. And what we found is that about half the states currently have a firewood heat treatment legal certification program in place, or stated that absolutely, were they to be requested, they have the legal and capacity framework in order to do so. Now that's just as good in my mind. I know in several cases that there are programs right now that have been written up, they are ready to go, and there is no firewood producer in that state that is currently requesting certification. That's totally fine, that's their choice. However, were there to be a firewood producer in your state that wanted to certify firewood so that it could participate in interstate trade involving states that have external quarantines, you want to make sure that you are enabling that trade if you're able to. And so what you see on this map is that the light green states that don't have the sort of box indicator that they are developing a program, so basically it's a work in progress, those states either do not currently have a plan to certify firewood or do not have the legal ability, which is the case in some states. Now, there is an important caveat to this, which is that the spongy moth federal quarantine, which is in the eastern United States, predominantly northeastern corner, could potentially enable the conditions to allow for the certification of firewood in some of these states that are demarcated with the lighter green. So for instance, just knowing the map off the top of my head, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland could likely put in place through the authorities afforded by the spongy moth quarantine, some type of firewood heat treatment certification program, were they to work with USDA APHIS. And I know that Russ and Anthony are the experts on this, but I just wanted to call that out as a reality, even though it is not marked on this map. There are 3 states currently that we know about that are working on these certification programs. That is Michigan, Illinois, and Louisiana. If you are working on a certification program and you are on this call and you are not marked on the map as working on it, please tell me, because we are putting out a revised map. I've done this presentation like 4 times in the last month, and every time we find that one of the something like 500 different data points might have had an error in it. And it would be great to eliminate all of those errors and make sure that we have absolutely the most accurate map and product possible, because we are striving for accuracy here, and it's an overwhelming amount of information. Of special note, during the research and correspondence process for the last 4 months of compiling this report, 7 different state plant regulatory officials spontaneously mentioned interest in some way in a third-party certification option for the heat treatment of firewood. Now, this conversation came up over and over again, so much so that finally we said, you know, this is notable. This is a special note. We did not anticipate that state plant health officials would say to us, you know, we do have a, you know, state-based firewood heat treatment program, but, you know, it would be really nice to be able to also offer a third-party certification potentially. It's just a passing comment, but once you get that passing comment 7 times, it's pretty striking. So I wanted to highlight that. Think about it. Think about whether or not you're interested in it. Last but not least, what we've been trying to do is also compare state-based online public outreach visibility. This is incredibly tricky because what we're trying to do is standardize and evaluate something that isn't standard and is intrinsically qualitatively evaluated. We've gotten, I just want to admit, a bit of pushback on this. However, as the manager of Don't Move Firewood's outreach education efforts, I can tell you for the last 14 years, we have done everything in our power to increase online public outreach visibility. And yet what we found is that it still hasn't reached all the places that we believe it should reach. And so we thought perhaps the best thing to do is talk about where has it not gone to yet? What gaps do we currently see that we could address? I want to make very clear, these aren't gaps in regulation or certification. These are not legal gaps. These are education and outreach gaps. So they are much more simple to address. Now, sometimes they're not as simple as we think, but they're a lot easier than changing a state regulation typically. So the 4 different places that we saw, that we decided to evaluate outreach visibility because we had to pick and choose in order to not basically make the scope of this report so big as to be useless, was state agency firewood-based communications, cooperative extension firewood-based communications, a state parks authority online camping related communications. So basically like Utah state parks or California state parks. And then the typically third party, although occasionally same party, campground reservation process pages. So you go to a state parks site and you pick out your park and then you hit make reservation, and usually you go over to a whole new website. It is sometimes, but not always, reserveamerica.com, but sometimes there's a different third party and sometimes it is not a third party. So it's a little bit of a chaos element. And in order to best figure this out, we thought, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll just pick 3 stratified campgrounds, one in the north or west, one in the central, and one in the south or east of every state, and just kind of like pick them off a map real fast. It's almost random, but not technically random, and then see what they've got. So here's what they've got. We found that state agency visibility of the firewood movement recommendations was great. High visibility recommendations were available at, I think that's 54 states. So it's really good visibility by state agencies. Typically speaking, that's either the State Department of Agriculture, State Department of Forestry, State Department of Natural Resources, or something like that. Every state has different agencies, as you all know. So we just sort of said, is it a major state agency that isn't their state parks authority? Then we looked at cooperative extension and we found a very different result. Cooperative extension typically had firewood information somewhat buried within pest and pathogen-based messaging. So it was typically on the emerald ash borer pest alert or the spongy moth spraying alert or something like that, which is not as high visibility as the 10 states that did have a specific firewood-based message on their extension websites. Then we looked at state parks. We found that state parks remarkably have a significantly lower amount of visibility than state agencies. So they are not always mirroring the recommendations of the state agencies found in the exact same states. And they also don't have a lot of pest-based materials like cooperative extension, so they don't even make up the difference. And they end up with actually a significant amount of just not found at all, any firewood movement recommendations. Then we looked at the state parks reservations sites. So, basically we pretended to make 150 campground reservations. We did not actually follow through, and I'll talk about that. And unfortunately, there was even fewer mentions of firewood recommendations once you got to the reservation site step. This is critically important because oftentimes this reflects on how you get the information in your email to confirm your reservation. And that is what the public often looks at as they're packing their car. So they want to know, oh, like what are the quiet hours? Do they have ice at the campground? And then in that same email and in that same information grouping, there should be a thing that says you can or cannot, or we recommend or we don't recommend regarding firewood. And that was actually the space that we found the least information in, which is not optimal in terms of outreach. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say I was going to cover something and I did not. So in state parks reservations, it is possible that some of the not found categorized state parks reservations site had firewood movement information found after purchase. We did not purchase 150 different campground reservations. We do know that in one case, for instance, there is firewood movement information on the payment envelopes, the physical payment envelopes available at a campground. The problem with that is you've already arrived at the campground. You already either did or did not move firewood. And so we restricted our analysis for logistical and financial reasons to pre-payment elements only. So it's an important caveat because it is possible that a few sites have a post-payment email that actually has good information in it. We were not able to evaluate that. All right, so looking forward, this webinar, apparently we are recording it and making it available soon. Excellent. We are doing individual state and territorial appendices, plus all revisions from the first 2 and 3 webinars and any feedback received. And that'll all be included in the second version of the Firewood report. The release date was going to be next week, but we've received more feedback than we anticipated, which is a good thing. People are really interested in this report. And so what we've realized is that realistically, we are not going to be able to get the second version out until about April 1st. I also want to make really clear that if you have been helping Laurel and I with the appendices of this report, that is an entirely separate thing from our public, state, and provincial summaries. They will not and do not follow that same format. The public and provincial summaries are based for the public. They're just information that the public should know. The appendices that you've been working on potentially with us are for professional use, for comparative use between professionals like all of us on this call. It's a very different audience. It contains very different information in very different formatting. If you want to see our public outreach materials, please go look at don'tmovefirewood.org/map or any part of the don'tmovefirewood.org website. But I just want to make really clear, this material that I've been covering today is professional sort of interagency communication and development. It is not the same as our public materials. I would love to take questions. I'm really excited that I successfully left 20 minutes in order to do Q&A and that I still have 18 people listening to this talk. So you have all automatically been muted for the sake of crowd management. But if you want to raise hands or ask questions in the chat or just shout out, That's what the next 20 minutes is for. Oh, and I do also want to say thank you so much to APHIS for funding all of this really important work, and Joey Caputo for helping me accommodate my schedule needs, because I will be out of town next week, and having this whole hour for you all to learn about firewood is just really helpful.
Hi, this is Russ. Very quickly, Anthony Manson-Hing, who is the Spongy Moth program manager, was unavailable to attend. He had another issue he had to deal with, so
Okay.
dealing with. But he, knowing that it's recorded, he's going to be looking at it. So
Fantastic. Thank you, Russ.
sure.
Don't everybody ask questions at once. Russ,
Yeah,
oh, go ahead.
sorry, this is Kyle from California. Could you just go over what third-party certification of firewood involves?
Absolutely. So in concept, it would be theoretically possible for a system much like the certification for the kiln drying and export of lumber. So the American lumber standards. This is just an example. I'm not saying anybody is pursuing this, but in concept, you could ask a third-party entity like the American lumber standard entity to certify kilns the same way that a state or federal agency could legally certify kilns. Now you would have to have, like I said, in concept, full reciprocity. So both the certifying entity, the standard, the third-party certifier, so a private business, would have to have their standards accepted by the states that have external quarantines. So for instance, if California had an external quarantine, they would have to accept that that private entity's certification methodology and auditing and paperwork and structure is all up to snuff. And if you had that in concept, states would not have to certify their own firewood. They could have a private entity certify firewood to allow it to enter into interstate commerce. It's a lot of words. It's a complicated concept. Kyle, did that cover your question?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks a lot. I'll ask if I have any more questions. Thanks a lot.
Yeah. Again, this doesn't exist right now, but it's an interesting concept and it keeps coming up. People keep asking, is this possible? Has anybody thought about it? This is really beyond my scope of work, just to be frank. I work on outreach, education, and policy. I don't work on third-party commerce, but it would allow for the safe movement of firewood. So I want to make sure people understand it. It keeps coming up conversationally on the safe movement of firewood, which is our goal.
Lee, I have a question.
Please.
So that was really informative, the bar graph you had with regards to, online information regarding, firewood, best practices and all that. And, it looks like the state agencies overall are doing really well on that. But the extension and state parks, it's kind of a mixed bag. And so I wondered, with this information, was Don't Move Firewood planning to kind of take a lead in reaching out to these groups, or is it state agencies that should be taking this information and then taking that to, our respective groups and trying to get them to kind of update materials? Just wondering, how best to proceed to fill those gaps.
Absolutely. So in the report, we also did our best to do a state-by-state evaluation of the results that you see on this graph. So this is the nationwide evaluation, but in the report, there's also a state-by-state version. Your question stands, who's going to take action here? And the answer basically is whoever is best suited to take action should. So for instance, if you work for a state agency and you have discovered that your state agency official recommendation or regulation is not reflected in the state parks material, you might just get the state parks folks on the line and say, let's fix this. And you might be the person with the right sort of leverage and professional position to get that job done quickly and simply, because it's your regulation and you would like to make sure visitors to the state parks are aware of it. However, in some cases, it's better for us to do it. There's a lot of sort of, political questions and appropriateness and interagency non-competitiveness that might come into play. It's a complicated world out there. A lot of states have, 4 or 5 relevant agencies to firewood in them, remarkably. And so, if you need help, if you have questions, if you want recommendations, that is the intent of Don't Move Firewood's next steps for this report. So when knowledge in some format is power. And if you see on the chart that your state has, 3 out of 4 excellent outreach venues rated as high visibility and 1 rated as low, well, then, if you want to take action, you could focus on that low visibility venue and see if you can improve it. I also will say that sometimes you may determine that you are okay with something being low visibility. So for instance, if you think the role of cooperative extension is to specifically message on pest-based information, and you believe for your state, they don't need to message firewood-based information with firewood as the core of the topic, that's your decision. And as long as that's something you're comfortable with, we're not here to tell you you're wrong. We're just saying it's not very visible.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. I also will say that we discovered we have made a few errors in this section as well, minor errors, but to the states that have errors, they're not minor, of course, because it's your state. So we'll be making a couple adjustments to the final version to make sure that we reflect the new information we've gathered. If anybody else wants to take a look at a chart or map and tell me I'm wrong, or ask questions about it, I think that this information often is a little overwhelming at first. We're talking about multiple realms of the movement of firewood, and that has huge implications for the potential movement of emerald ash borer as well. Let me just make sure chat doesn't have anything. Russ's love for our data visualizations continues. So he says he loves the periodic table of firewood certification. Thank you, Russ. We've been really pleased with people's reactions to all of the data visualization that we've been doing. It makes the information easier to digest for sure. It also makes it really PowerPoint friendly, quite frankly. If you go to the report itself, you will discover that the report has a huge amount of very fine-grained information available as well. But I certainly did not want to put all that fine-grained information into the PowerPoint itself, because that would be unmanageable. So Kyle Johnson says, excellent presentation. Thank you, Kyle. And that he had not yet heard about the spongy moth name change. You're welcome. That only happened officially. The announcement was only about 2 weeks ago, so you're not too far behind at all. The rollout of the name change is not going to be obviously universal and instantaneous. So everybody is just encouraged to educate themselves on the name change and roll out new materials according to your abilities. If you do a web search for spongy moth and Entomological Society of America, you'll find a lot of supporting information on that.
It's going to be slow for PPQ, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I did see that there was a stakeholder announcement saying that there's some logistical challenges that you're encountering. But different agencies are just going to have different approaches, but hopefully we'll all be able to switch over eventually.
Yeah.
Jeff Knight says there's many more, I'm guessing you mean many more name changes. I don't know if that's accurate or not. I think that certainly it's an open discussion. But what I do know is that there are many changes in firewood regulations coming. Let's go back to that page. It's important to see here that the West has 2 of the upcoming external regulation changes. So Hawaii and Nevada have upcoming external quarantines. And if any other state is putting in place an upcoming or even proposing or working on an upcoming external quarantine, I would love to update the map if it does not represent what you understand for your state or an adjacent state. Well, we've got 10 minutes left. I'm here for questions and comments, and anybody else need anything? Russ, did I get anything wrong?
No, I think you did well. Thank you. You're always spot on.
I hope so. I appreciate that. Kyle says, great presentation. Thank you, Kyle. We got two Kyles. It's a little confusing today. Jeff says, thank you. Excellent. One thing I'll jump over because it's kind of funny / a little bit of a sign of the times is, hold on, there we go. This firewood on the right-hand side, this European split white birch is a product of, I believe, Latvia, which is a country in Europe. And I took this picture on the big island of Hawaii. The firewood coming in from international sources that are not in North America, so not Mexico, not Canada, all has to be heat treated at 71 Celsius for 75 minutes, as is on that label. And because the heat treatment of firewood is not universally available in US markets, and because of sort of the vagaries of supply chains everywhere, you see this European firewood that has been quite heat treated for sale throughout the United States and even on Hawaii. And it really, I think, really speaks to how difficult the firewood market is to understand, that it is somehow a viable economic product for Ace Waimea in the middle of the Hawaiian Islands to be selling European white birch from Latvia is really quite, I found it really shocking. But obviously they're making money off of it and it's convenient because otherwise they would not do it. This product is also fairly often found in stores like big box stores, kind of like Home Depot. I have had people send me photographs of this from Whole Foods. They sell this at Whole Foods in DC, I discovered once. Somebody sent me a picture. Jeff Knight asks, has anyone sampled these to determine effectiveness of heat treatment? The effectiveness of heat treatment at large certainly has been verified multiple times. Whether or not this particular product has been sort of audited at the ports is something I don't know. That would be a question for Customs and Border Protection or USDA APHIS for sure. But it's a very common, remarkably common problem. So, you know, I would certainly hope that somebody's been sampling them to determine the effectiveness of heat treatment. Ryan from Washington, if memory serves, says, do I have outreach that we can have trappers? Hey, Russ, can you mute?
Yes, I'm sorry.
It's okay. Yes, I have lots of outreach. The question is what type of outreach you'd like. We have a remarkable array of it. I highly recommend everybody go to Don't Move Firewood /resource library. It's like this, I think. If I remember correctly, oops, obviously that's don'tmovefirewood.org. Sorry, I was typing too fast. But if you have a specific request for a certain item, like Haley, we need a brochure, or Haley, we need a poster, I can direct you to the most recent brochures or posters that would fit your need. I'm going to put my email here so that people can copy and paste it, even though it's on the slide. That is my correct email, and I can get you digital copies of a tremendous number of different pieces of outreach. We are working to update all of our outreach items that mention specific pests, including spongy moth to say spongy moth. That's a work in progress. It's going to take a while, but our most popular items we've already updated. So Kyle says we need cheap ways to treat firewood. So I am guessing informally and seasonally, perhaps method that involves seasoning for X months would be good enough. Firewood and camping are integral to the American way of life, so we need realistic solutions. Just some thoughts. Kyle, I absolutely agree. And I will say that it is not necessary for firewood safety to always heat treat firewood. You can also use it very locally, because the issue is not specific to firewood unto itself. The issue is to the movement of firewood past the natural boundaries of forest pests or the invasive boundaries of forest pests. And so for instance, if you live in an area where you don't have a tremendous forest pest issue, use of local firewood should be fine. And the sale of local firewood should be fine. Russ Bullock is saying, yes, proximity is very important in firewood. So using local firewood is really important. And I will, let me just pull up, let's see if I can do this. This is just going to take me a half a second here. One moment, please. I'll pull up one of our more recent outreach materials that you can all see very directly how we focus on this. One moment, I'm almost there. All right, that'll do it. So you all may be familiar with the Old Farmer's Almanac. It's kind of a gardener's type publication. The USDA APHIS cooperative agreement that I work with Russ and Anthony and other people on funds some magazine placements. This is one of the magazine placements that funds. And it is a full page ad within the Farmer's Almanac. And it says, buy it where you burn it. And just really, Kyle, to get directly to your statement, it says right here, buy locally harvested firewood at or near your destination. Buy certified heat treated firewood ahead of time if available, because we all know it's not always available. We just talked about that. And then you can always gather firewood on site when permitted. So these are the options that are really important to present to the public. It does not have to be heat treated. That's not required. It is required if you're going to be moving firewood across many states, across quarantine boundaries, et cetera. But it's not strictly necessary in every single situation, in every single case. And I hope that's helpful to put that into perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe, you know, like, I'm just trying to think of the most realistic, because if you're going to have a general regulation, you know, where do you draw the line? And I don't know. I mean, maybe a state, you know, boundary, and, you know, that might be the most realistic and practical way to do it, you know, for just general firewood.
No, I mean, absolutely. And I will actually take a moment to point you all to the National Plant Board's Firewood Guidelines document. I did help author sections of it, although not all of it. If you go to the National Plant Board website and click on the word firewood in the menu, it will bring it up. And the reason I mentioned that, Kyle, specifically is that document talks about best practices, options, and it has templates to give you an idea of what a firewood regulation could look like from the state-by-state perspective. What it doesn't have is what we produced as the Firewood Comparison Report. So it doesn't have comparisons between states. It just has like case studies and templates and scientific information. So putting those two documents together provides you with both what can you do, what's scientifically accurate, what are other states using as the like legal wording, as well as what are the, and then you look at the Firewood Comparison Report, you can say, what are the other states doing? Which is sometimes different from what's an option. So the two pieces of information put together give you a comprehensive approach. It's a lot of information though. So if you have specific questions for your state or region or situation, you know, I would urge you to reach out either to me or to Russ or to the National Plant Board if that's appropriate for you. They're great to work with and just kind of dig into the problem, because understanding all of your options is going to be part of how you come up with the solutions that are right for your state. Well, on that note, you really set me up to close out on a good one, Kyle, so I appreciate it. I really urge anybody to reach out if you need help finding any materials. I will post this webinar with Joey's help to the Western EAB group in whatever format Joey's got for me. And I hope you all have a great day. I'm going to close up the recording and you can all log off.
Thank you.
Thank you.